So why do I use Anchor? Because basically, it's the easiest app of all the apps that I've ever used, all the services I've ever used to do podcasting with. It's the only one where it's been super easy to just log in via an app on my phone or right online on my laptop and be able to record and edit and create sound bites and trailers for episodes in a real easy fashion. No complicated softwares or mixers or setups. If you have a microphone in your computer or your smartphone, you can go right on and just make an episode that's easy to do, easy to distribute. Because guess what? If you're hosting on Anchor, your stuff gets promoted to everything. I mean, I'm on Apple Music, I'm on Google Play, I'm on um, you name it. I'm on Spotify right away. All the top, outlets you get promoted to. And you know what? At the end of the day, what more can you ask for? You really shouldn't be going anywhere else. Just download it from the App Store or Google Play.
So who is Kale Sanderson? Kale Sanderson is somebody that's considered by many one of the greatest wrestlers, if not the greatest wrestler of all time, freestyle wrestler. Currently coach Penn State. Um, coaches Penn State. I'm sorry. And the thing about him is, he's somebody that in the wrestling world, I guess, is a very prominent figure. I didn't know about him until a recent conversation, which led me to even more knowledge. Um, the one thing you don't often see is, who was this man's coach, and that coach is Bobby Douglas. Bobby Douglas's name doesn't ever come up. Oftentimes, you see these wrestlers and they talk about who their coaches were and what their lineage was, much like you do in martial arts. But for whatever reason, when Kel Sanders' name comes up, it doesn't seem like it's easily linked to Bobby Douglas unless you have that information, unless you're specifically asking who his coach was. Just a little weird, but whatever. That's a point that, and all this information was brought to light for me to me. Like I said, in a recent conversation that you guys are about to hear, um, from somebody I've come to respect very much for both his martial arts prowess and his intellect. Um, his name is D.A. Carman, and we had a discussion that sort of began with talking about the relationship between these two and exactly what I just kind of brought up. And we go on to talk a little bit about wrestling and other things that you guys are going to get to hear. And I just hope you guys enjoy this one. The information is wonderful. And at the end of the episode, I'm going to give out all the information for where you can look up other content that this gentleman has put out because I'm a big fan of everything that he puts out. All right, guys.
Hello. Okay, yeah, he's considered to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest wrestler of all time, collegiate wrestler. 159 wins and zero losses out of Iowa State, I believe. First year 39 and 0, second year 40 and 0, third year 40 and 0, fourth year 40 and 0. And you know, I talk about wrestling and how even though I love karate and started boxing first, I consider myself to be a wrestler first and foremost. And getting black people to understand their the wrestling legacy, not just in Africa, but even in collegiate wrestling in the West, is one of the hardest things to do. And I had to remind a gentleman when he told me how good Cael Sanderson was, I had to remind him that his collegiate coach was none other than Bobby Douglas, a black man who coached him to 159 and 0, also coached him to his gold medal in the Olympics, and also beat the great Dan Gables uh, uh, in
Bobby
collegiate.
Douglas beat Dan Gables.
Absolutely. Yep. The same coach that coached Cael Sanderson to 159 and 0. But this is the kind of thing. Sometimes, people may say, well, okay, well, how can you accuse people of things? Well, when you have people who are wrestling fanatics and they don't know Bobby Douglas was the coach of Sanderson, then that's an excuse I don't accept. So and there's so much that going around with the Joe Rogan crowd that that's basically my thing. That's why I even stay on social media, is to remind people of certain legacies that they want to cover up. But yeah, he beat Dan Gable.
What you're saying is like you're saying that you feel like people say that he's the greatest wrestler of all time, but overshadow where his roots came from. Bobby Douglas is what you're saying.
Right. And I mean, he's acknowledged it. I mean, he's acknowledged that Bobby Douglas. He's actually on YouTube, and like these things are like obvious, Fred. They're like really obvious where people get on YouTube and social media and they look at all these things, but somehow when it comes down to legacies of black martial artists, in particular, it was boxing. But when comes down to like Danny Bill, probably the best pure Muay Thai kickboxer ever lived. When it comes down, Danny Bill, D-A, yes, DANYBILL. Originally from Cameroon, family moved to France, and he started kickboxing when he was 15. Now here's a story with him, just to digress a bit, and now and people would say, well, they just didn't know. Like, here's a man who won the Muay Thai championships, right? 7 years in a row. 7 years in a row in Thailand. Okay?
I never heard of him. That's crazy.
Okay? And there are people who consider him to be, there's several levels to Thai kickboxing. And I'm not going to butcher the language, but in Thai, there's different levels. I think there's like 4 levels. So some are considered to be the Thai word for a particular style that means your heavy hands and minimal kicks. And then you have some who are ultimate technicians. The Thais consider this man, Danny Bill, to be one of the greatest technicians, not just kickboxers, but technicians. So what I mean by technician is he's great in the plum. He's great in the clinch, throwing a man a certain way into his roundhouse, these kind of things. Okay. Now, how do you have a man win the Muay Thai championships 7 years in a row? Okay. And people who are Muay Thai enthusiasts don't know who he is. See, at some point, people just have to make that leap and assume there's something going on. You can't know, a guy cannot know, these people cannot know Kel Sanderson, right? And not know who his coach was. They have to know who his coach was because he's in pictures with him. At the end, when he wins the Olympic gold medal, whose arm does he jump in? He jumps in the arm of Bobby Douglas. And when he jumps in the arm of Bobby Douglas on live TV, the commentator says, there's his coach, Bobby Douglas. But I just got finished looking at a YouTube video on Kel Sanderson. And before I commented on the video, I'm going up and down, up and down, up and down. Not one person comments that, hey, that you got to give credit to his coach. And I guarantee you, if Dan Gables was his coach, it would be no secret.
They would have said the great Dan Gable coach.
Of course they would have. The great Dan Gables did it again. Is this no doubt he's the greatest wrestling coach ever? Look what he did with a guy 159-0. So, these are the reasons why I even stay on, because we talk. And, I don't even I'm so tired of martial arts community. But the reason why I stay on is for moments like this. Moments like this. People, it's just ridiculous. And when you consider I've been on since 2011, and I've gotten a whole lot of flack by saying stuff like Lomachenko. Well, let's be honest, right? I mean, people who hear this podcast, they're not going to be surprised at what I'm saying. Lomachenko, and me and my wife are just talking about it. Lomachenko, poor thing, what's going on in Ukraine, but that's another story. Russians don't see themselves as white. They don't. But there are people who looked at Lomachenko and said, okay, he's white. I didn't argue with it. Okay, no problem. Right? Regardless as to that, I always said this man to this day people are looking over him. If you look at his punching power and his ability to box, one could say, and I would not argue with it. If they said he was the best fighter pound for pound, yes, over Canelo Alvarez, I wouldn't waste my time arguing.
I agree with you 100%.
Right? You see what I mean? He's just that good. If you argue with that, Fred, you'd be arguing just to have something to say. Right?
Yeah.
I don't say, well, just because he's not a black guy. I mean, it helps that he likes Ali, but, I wouldn't say, I'm biased like that. Right? But, I mean, I would say just because he's a black guy, right? I mean, he's not great. He's not good. Look what I did with Conor McGregor. You had Muslims saying, man, how could you go against Conor McGregor? I told him that's not what you asked me. You asked me if he had a chance to beat Khabib. Now, I mean, I was way off, but I mean, hey, who knew? As Rodney Dangerfield would say, who knew? I mean, I didn't know, but what I saw of Conor McGregor, I felt I was justified in saying it because based on the question that people asked me. So the whole thing is this dishonesty. I said all that to say this: the dishonesty in the martial arts is really, really a big reason why my mentors don't want anything to do with social media. And it's a shame, especially now that you have this podcast. It's a shame because they would be great interviews.
I agree with you, and I think that I understand why people want to avoid certain elements of social media, but at the same time, for people like me who, very much respect the old guard and wish that we've had that same talk before about how the
Sure.
martial arts community, of course, like you say, is there's a lot of dishonesty on many levels, but bringing a little bit of light to that, like one thing that's great about this new culture with social media is that a lot of BS gets called out. The problem is that sometimes it's too much of the calling out. People get too caught up in that race too. But I think that just the same way that we could go in the octagon and people could have it out and you get to see what's what, like whose style was superior, whose training camp was superior. All of those questions get answered. Like this is how you fix that. You know what I mean? Because before the UFC, like everybody thought maybe Kung Fu Death Touch was the stuff. You know what I mean? Like
that's true. That's true.
Until those fights started happening and the truth was revealed, you know what I mean? Even with the beginning of the UFC till today, you got Gracie, right? Everybody all of a sudden thought Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Everybody said Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the king of everything. Until people figured out how to keep them from falling into the guard.
Right.
And then it was over. Now the game evolved.
Right.
So I don't know. I do wish that things like this, these kinds of discussions happen more because, for example, I mean, first off, thank you for enlightening me today because I had no idea. I didn't know anything about Kill Sanders' coach, and I definitely did not know about this Muay Thai fighter who I'm going to spend some time watching some highlights later of. But that brings me to a point, man, because like my podcast is sort of about fighting, but more about fighting in life and the metaphor of life or fighting for life and all that. And it's interesting that you kicked off this conversation with what you did because there's a few martial arts that harness or that build a strong mentality, like say wrestling. What is it about wrestling that you think does that? Is it the structure of wrestling? Is it the style itself? Like what is it about wrestling that creates such a tough mentality?
I was thinking about that the other day. And I now I can answer it without mumbling, I think. But I'm a little tired, so I might come across mumbling anyway. But when let's use boxing and let's compare. Well, let's use boxing, karate, and wrestling. You know what? Let's use wrestling and all of them. You can box and you can go very light. barely touching an individual, because you touching them lightly still represents contact and still represents um, a punch that wasn't blocked, right? So you can learn from barely getting touched in boxing. The same thing applies to karate. It's hard for you to control your kicks, as compared to controlling your punches, but you can kind of take something off. You can take some mustard off of your kicks, and a person can learn without being knocked out. Same thing really with Muay Thai. It's kind of hard to pull your elbow or pull a headbutt or a knee, because you're bringing a person into your knee as your knee is rising up if you're going to do it properly. But if you're kicking and punching, then you can still take some mustard off. We contrast that with wrestling, though. Wrestling, you're trying to take a person down. You're not just making contact. You're not just attaching yourself to the person. You're ultimately trying to take them down. Now, unless they're going to go down voluntarily, it takes a certain amount of drive and a certain amount of conviction to get a person from a standing position to being down in some form. So even if you were going light or flowing in wrestling, it demands more conviction than other martial arts, where you can simulate contact and it's still considered training. If I'm being clear.
Yeah, I think ultimately what you're saying is, it seems like it's the training, the way wrestling has to be trained and practiced.
Yeah, where
Is
there's
what
really no.
that, because it's a more constant pressure.
Well, yeah, but what I'm saying is, now there's more constant pressure in wrestling, true, but the minimum, that's where I'm going. The minimum amount of effort that it takes to be a
It's
wrestler
higher.
is still more
It's
than,
much
okay,
higher.
like
Right. I understand.
say if you're boxing with the guy and you're working on his defense, if a punch gets close to him, he knows if he didn't block it. You see, you can train and box and really not hit somebody very hard at all.
Right.
But you cannot get that man off of his feet unless
Without
he's
lifting.
going down by himself.
Right.
You see, so and at the most rudimentary level, it takes more effort to train in wrestling, even at the most basic level, even in the most friendliest, even a friendly type of role takes more effort in wrestling than it does to do just about any other martial art. So it's a mindset at minimum you need to wrestle.
Hmm.
At
That,
minimum, yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. And when I think back to, like, I mean, I'll admit, as somebody who always preferred the striking, like, training was always like the most tedious, specifically for that reason, that it was like
Hmm.
halfway through the training session, I was already more tired than I would be sometimes going through one or two training sessions of kickboxing.
Yeah.
And especially with
Let me
like
let me
knees
say
and
this.
stuff like that.
Let me say this to you before I forget. Yeah, I'm old. I'll forget this thing. Okay. Let's look at how many fights, Fred, start when people are just pushing and shoving,
True.
right? When people are
Okay.
pushing or shoving, pushing, or we can say pushing and shoving, the same thing. Pushing or pulling, kind of roughhousing, right?
Yeah.
They
It
connect
seems
to
like
each other,
wrestling is a natural instinct for people.
right? But what I'm saying here is, look at how many fights that go to blows, that end up in blows being thrown, right? When initially there was just this kind of wrestling going on. You see what I'm saying? Like, say two people, they're playing around, okay? Eventually, they attach and they're doing some kind of crude kind of wrestling, right? Not
Hmm.
collegiate, not really over and under, going for duck unders, but they're just a rough house.
Right.
Look at how easy it is for those particular situations to get violent and blows to be thrown. Now, the reason is what I just said. At the minimum, there's a certain amount of roughhousing, certain amount of conviction needed to get a person off balance, unless they voluntarily are off balance or voluntarily go down. And that doesn't help unless you're trying to teach them some submission, you know, on the ground, and you're just saying, okay, let me show you how this takedown goes so we can chain the takedown and submission together. But otherwise, a person's trying to stay on their feet. In order to get that person off their feet and they're determined to stay on their feet, it takes a certain amount of force. That kind of force is so intense. That's why most people playing around roughhousing, even calling themselves wrestling, it gets aggressive, even between friends and family members, because of the kind of conviction it takes on a most rudimentary level compared to other disciplines.
Hmm. Now, see, that's interesting because going back to what I was saying earlier with the tough mentality and all
Mm-hmm.
that. I think that's the key for a lot of these issues. Like I kind of segued off, and it seemed like it didn't matter, but I had brought up the issue of the young man in the park and the police officers because
Yeah.
in my head, if people aren't tested with things,
Mm-hmm.
they'll never know how to react when that test or when the actual thing comes. And something about martial arts in general, which again leads also to the dishonesty talk we were having, is that, and we talked about this before, is the commercialization and the softening of martial arts. Um, and in my view, when these kind of things happen, it's like anything that we don't test ends up becoming like a cancerous version of it. So you get like ideological things, right? Like you get like the guys who now have martial arts followers who think that they're gonna learn the magic jujitsu technique or the magic death touch palm or whatever it
Oh
is,
yeah.
or and like that can't exist outside of that rough and tumble, like you said, like that, because it is true that like fighting has to come from a place of ego, right? Because what you're saying is that basically because it takes more conviction to say for me to try to grapple you and take you down, now
Mm-hmm.
it takes more conviction for you to say, oh no, you're not going to take me down.
Right.
And so
Right.
now that push and pull gets stronger, it escalates.
Absolutely. There you
But
go.
what it takes is for me and you to figure out who's really going to be the dominant one, is for that struggle to happen.
Um. Yeah. Well, when you're wrestling, you're not. You're trying to dominate the other person. You're trying to get to your most advantageous position.
Right.
So you're really trying to predict what he's going to do. You're trying to read his movements. You're trying to chain your movements together. Ultimately, you're trying to get that person in a position where they can't continue to defend themselves.
Right. To close them off.
So yeah, so it's not a case of um you don't decide. You don't decide. You don't really be a wrestling. You don't say, I want this person to knock me down. I
Right.
mean, you no, 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 no. Uh, I'm just thinking about really how, really how primitive it is. I was trying to look for a different word, but it's just so primitive. Wrestling is just so primitive. And I think another reason it's so primitive and it leads to fighting is because it can lead to fighting if you don't have an agreement uh, uh, when you initiate your training. Is this: we all have a sense of our personal space. Wrestling is one art that invades your personal space.
Very true.
So I was just thinking about that just now. I never thought about it. But just now, as I'm speaking to you, I was trying to think, what is it that I need to articulate that I didn't really get across? And I think that's it too. When someone is up on you like that, and they're trying to knock you off your feet, which most of us, other than someone who still buys into, pulling guard is the best way to beat six people. Um, Other than that, people know that you're in a position of weakness when you're off your feet. that is something that you are going to always usually struggle to do anyway, right? Stay on your feet. So this constant trying to stay up while you're trying to not take the other person off of their feet, trying to do that while your space, the personal space is being invaded. You know, I mean, what someone gets within 6 inches of you and you're like, yo, not even that, it's within a foot. And you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Yeah.
Well, imagine what happens when you're grappling with someone. It's very difficult. I have wrestled in high school, I wrestled with friends, and it was very hard to keep that friendship. So hard, we used to have different training partners because it just gets that intense. But I can box with people and it not get intense. I can spar with people and it not get intense. And the reason is because or I know, or someone else knows when they couldn't block a punch. How many times have you threw a punch at someone and said, I could have hit you, right?
Right.
Comes within 4 or 5 inches, you can do that. And you can still know, yeah, my defense wasn't good. Why? Because if Fred had extended his hand, his arm, I would have been hit. Wrestling is no such thing based on what you're trying to do. You're trying to take the person down. Unless that person flops down themselves, it takes a certain amount of effort to get that person down. And that effort in itself takes a certain amount of aggression. And with that aggression comes a certain attitude. So, wrestling is just so much to it and I want to say this too, the whole culture of wrestling, from cutting, I used to cut like 15 pounds in 2 weeks. You having to cut weight and still train to the point of vomiting. I mean, when you're cutting weight, you still have to train. Now imagine full body sauna suit, right? You have to cut 15 pounds in 2 weeks, okay? And you still have to continually wrestle for maybe a half hour. Now we're talking about wrestling for a half hour without a break.
Yeah, it's
I
torture.
mean, it's just the brain. I mean, the kind of mindset that develops is what you see in the UFC. I mean, that UFC is people don't want to admit it, but the whole culture of the UFC is wrestling culture. It's wrestling culture. The diet, the weightlifting, the cutting weight. It didn't come from karate or boxing or Muay Thai.
No,
That
you're right.
whole preparation for the UFC, all of that, the culture of the UFC, the mindset of the UFC, the weight training, like I said, the weight training, the diet, the cutting of the weight, right? The rehydration, all of that. That's really the culture of wrestling. Yeah, I get kind of excited, excuse me, when I talk about wrestling. I
No,
get
listen,
myself.
that's actually, that's exactly what I came on to talk about. But now so that it seems like it's a multitude of things then, right? Because you said, it's not just the structure of the training, but the nature of the art itself. Like you said, it's a very invasive thing, and that's the number one
That's
thing that
it.
makes us
Yeah.
fight back is to, once somebody's on top of you, you have no choice but to fight back.
You know what? That's good. What you said, evasive. That's good. That's it. That's what I think is in a nut. That's it in a nutshell. That's the issue with wrestling. It's
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 very
it's
invasive.
evasive. It's very evasive. That's the word I've been looking for. That's it. And yeah, that's the best way to explain. I got to remember that. And that's why people get so emotional, when they are wrestling, as opposed to simulating striking, because
So
it's
it's kind of
evasive.
almost like trauma. It's almost like people going through violent things their whole life develop a certain trigger. Wrestling just makes you because of the constant fight, the
Mm,
torture of the weight cut. Like you said, the whole culture around wrestling
yeah.
seems to revolve around suffering almost.
Wow.
Well,
See,
in a good way, because I
no,
say that I
because you
know
know
it.
what? This is not really people. People who will hear this know that I don't BS. So what I say is what I mean. I started wrestling when I was 14. I've never talked about it like what you just brought up. And my mother used to say, "Don't piss on my leg and tell me it's raining." So I'm not saying this to make you feel good, but it's true. It is a little traumatic, Fred. It is a little, when I think about wrestling, it is. It takes, and I think that's why it took a lot for me to come down after every training session. Like to even be able to talk, like to take the shower and then have an orange juice with the guy that I was training with. And there were times I think because like what you said, it is traumatic in a way, especially when you're going at it with another guy for 15 minutes and you're trying to escape. And then this constant dogged determination to get you off your feet. And then your dogged determination to defend that and then to counter and get him off of his feet. And you're right. It can be traumatic.
And the thing about
Yeah.
it is that it's a constant thing, right? Because like you said, even in an all out fight, if me
hmm
and you are in an all out, kickboxing match,
hmm
there's a pacing to it. I can slow you down, you can slow me down. I can
Good.
dance
That's
around, I
it.
can
You're
catch my
right.
breath, I can
Again.
keep you at bay with my reach to say, all right, let me keep them at bay so I can catch my breath and load up on some power shots later. You can't do that if somebody's constantly trying to pin you down. It's constant
Again.
resistance.
Again. You're on a roll. Again. That's it. You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
That's it. It's constant. It's constant. And sometimes, like now, I'm laughing. But
Even
some,
jujitsu, because jujitsu
sometimes,
guys, and well,
yeah.
you and I have
No,
a
go ahead.
similar stance on jujitsu, but even
Yeah,
jujitsu guys will say, "Oh yeah, it's the same thing." No, it's not, because I've seen jujitsu guys get into a position and hold that position, and you
absolutely.
could
Yeah.
tell,
So
yeah,
you were saying, but yeah, the jujitsu, right?
yeah, like I feel like they
Holding
oftentimes
positions.
you can see them hold the position because they're calculating the next move. Like they'll
Yeah.
hold the person in a position because they're like, this, I'm safe in this position. They have opportunities to do things, but it buys me time to think, well, plot out my next move. In wrestling, there is none of that. It's just a constant struggle till you either pin the person or get the headlock or whatever it is, depending on whatever style of wrestling it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that makes total sense to me now, and I'm glad that you helped answer that question for me, because it is a question that I've been wondering, like, why? What is it about wrestling above all? And I think even something like a really hard style. And I think,
hmm
yeah, it was you who said this to me, that the only other type of
Yeah.
practice that ever made you throw up was a Kyokushin class. Was that you
Yep.
that said that?
Yep.
Yeah, and
Yep.
that's the thing about Kyokushin that I enjoyed very much, and it made me realize, I was like, I wonder if this is what like constant grappling training is, because it was the pressure that they would put on you in a Kyokushin class. Sometimes I'd be like, man, this is insane. And you're
Yep.
right, it's the only I think I've only twice in my life have thrown up during training, and
Yeah.
one of them was during, like, right after a Kyokushin class.
Now you just used that term evasive, right?
Invasive.
Invasive, right?
Yes.
Now look at that. Look at that style,
Right.
right?
Very in your face,
In
constant.
your face, constantly.
Right.
You know,
Right.
it's same principle. And I've seen some of those matches get out of hand. You
Oh
know,
yeah. Oh
yeah,
yeah.
it's easy.
I understand, yeah. And listen, like, so that's kind of what I was saying, that, like, for example, those officers, they haven't been tested. A lot of people get into themselves into positions like, all right, I'll be a cop. But
hmm
when you're choosing to be a cop, you realize that you're choosing somebody that's going to have to fight at some point or another. You're going to have to fight. Most of us don't enter professions like that. Most people
Right.
enter a profession where they're going to know they're going to sit at a desk, maybe they travel, whatever, but nobody's thinking, I'm going to have to fight. Unless you actively said, I'm going to go be a professional fighter. Nobody, or a soldier. Nobody's thinking, I'm going to have to fight. Even cops. Even cops are thinking, oh, I'm going to be the law, this and that. I think that incident that I saw today with that young man,
hmm
and a lot of, like, the things we've talked about, for example, with the jujitsu community, and how, and how overplayed it is,
Yeah.
and things like that, comes from exactly this, and from that poor ideologies that develop from not testing yourselves. Like I feel like because the reason I thought of this is because one of the guys that was observing what was going on with that young man earlier in the park is a gentleman that I always see by this park working out. So he recognized me. He said, "Don't worry, I was watching too. In fact, I was recording the whole thing."
Okay.
And he tells me, you know, that this is the problem with the fact that they let police officers handle people that might have a mental health issue because
Wow. Yeah.
first off, the guy definitely looked a little off, but
Hmm.
him getting crowded by 9 people with guns and and body armor all of a sudden, that's not a, what if he did flip out? He would have been right to flip out.
Yeah. You're
And
right.
considering he really wasn't doing anything other than walking through the park looking a little funny.
Yeah.
But you look at that, you look at the poor ideas in martial arts is because of a lack of testing, a lack of training, a lack of, like you said, I mean, or like how wrestling or like how Kyokushin would put it, the constant invasiveness of
Hmm.
having to face whatever it is, whatever that thing is. And then, of course, in the case of wrestling, it's another human being trying to pile drive you. In Kyokushin, it's a person trying to drive their fist through your chest.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But like either way, it's a thing that you have to face, an adversity that's not gonna go away. And there is it if you cower, it's just gonna tear you up.
That's true. That's true.
And there you have it. A conversation with the premier martial artist is all it took to get the answer about why wrestling is so tough. Or what makes so many wrestlers so tough. Why is that mentality, especially in the UFC and MMA? Um, why is it that those guys seem to thrive better? Um, Partially it's because the culture, they're already used to the culture, and then of course the as we heard, the invasive nature of wrestling and what it does to the mind. Um, it's just what it does. It's the outcome of constant pressure. I mean, pressure makes diamonds, right? You hear that all the time. Um, Big thank you to Dia Carmen, and for the knowledge and the information on Danny Bill and Kale Sanderson, two guys that I've since looked at a lot of footage on, and have felt very very fortunate too, especially with Danny Bill. I love kickboxing, and Danny Bill, I can't believe he actually beat one of my favorite fighters of all time, in Ramon Deckers. Um, yeah, fantastic gems to pick up there. Um, Look out for the rest of the conversation coming out soon, and I'll be dropping the fully unedited conversation on YouTube in the near future. Look out for that.